lot of issues you brought up, but one in particular, you talked at the end about the conflation or the growing conflation of development and security studies. And I'm actually curious as well, if you take your argument one step further in terms of the issue of development and the reconstruction of the state. So what happens in the longer term process of development specifically I'm talking about governance. So if we assume that development has this colonial history, which I agree, then what happens when the state is reconstructed, and how is it reconstructed in particular ways? I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about that. So talk specifically about how the subject, but I'm just curious about how maybe your concept of governance would relate to this.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I was just, I'm not sure this will turn into a question, but it'll be a comment and see what happens. As you were talking about the kind of degenerate, racialized, other belonging to particular geographical spaces, and at the very end sort of talk about kind of transnational litigation discussion, post-colonial theory. I was also thinking about along the side of kind of degenerate, racialized, so there are the kind of stories of the valorization of the kind of local heroic other within development. And it seems to me that these stories especially arise within kind of partnership, notions of partnership, right? Linkages, say, across non-profit organizations, right, here in Canada and Africa, say, for example. And so this kind of is there a way which is with the racist love that goes alongside the kind of degenerate, racialized discourses that we see within a kind of transnational partnership.
Interesting questions. If I can start with the second one, because I'm not quite sure that I got the question. I wasn't talking about security studies.
Yeah,
I was talking about a discourse of security, which is now central to a discourse of development, and unashamedly so. You know, it's in Development Assistance Committee reports, it's in the UN reports, that development now, poverty alleviation, is necessary in order to secure security. And I think that when you frame a discourse around Western security, you're shifting, you're completely shifting the ways in which people understand the relationship between the West and the rest, and privileging certain kinds of understandings within that. So, so that wasn't security studies, it really is the big security. You know, that's what I was talking about. But if you're talking about governance generally, I think that that shift at independence. A lot of the colonial administrators, for example, were asked to stay on, and they were asked to stay on because the newly independent states were setting up systems of government, and they clearly replicated the British system of government. And so there is that link, and you can still see that in India now when you go to government offices, you can see that it's all report writing, it's all about records, and it's very much sort of British, a Victorian British system of classification and categorization. In terms of governance, discourses on governance, I think that my sort of intervention there is to really think about what we call good governance. Is there bad governance, and what does it look like? And is all governance good? Or is there some governance that isn't good? So I'm not really clear. I would like to sort of unpack that notion of governance and see what its constitutive elements are, and what is meant by good governance, and what are the different ways in which we can understand governance. And I think that people are doing that. I mean, there are people within development who are looking at the whole issue of governance and trying to understand it and look at it through that historical perspective, but also try and unpack it, deconstruct the notion, the Western notion of governance, and what it might mean. And I think that it's played out most acutely now in a discourse of corruption. And it's not surprising that we have that discourse of corruption there. And there is a corruption index. And there are whole groups of Western consultants going around different various African countries and ticking boxes that have been created in, through Western benchmarks around corruption and linking that notion of corruption to a notion of governance. So I don't know whether I really understood your question, but those are some very sort of sporadic and not very well thought out thoughts on governance. Colonial administrators, I mean, I could, they're my passion. I just love colonial administrators. And they love me too, which is very interesting. And it was true, because I would go and I would be sort of, very nervous about meeting, my stereotypical view of a colonial administrator, and friends would say, oh, don't worry, they'll love you. And they did, and I wondered why. And then I was reading Derrida, and Derrida said, there is something like, how can one love? One loves mainly through memory. And that's what it was. It was that somebody was interested in that whole moment of that sort of separation from colonial administrator, that whole renegotiation after independence about, it's like, what did you do in the war? It's like, what did you do during the colonial period to say that you were a colonial administrator? It was uncomfortable in certain situations. But I was asking them to remember. And of course, my own subjectivity had a huge part to play in the way in which they, the language they used, for example, the way in which they presented their stories. And I'm not denying that. Of course, that must be, as anybody's subjectivity would. But, clearly I would have been there, if sitting in their sitting rooms or wherever, if, they hadn't been in India. So, there was certainly some kind of connection there. And the ways in which they understood what they were doing, remember these are colonial administrators who moved into development after the countries they were posted to gained independence. So they had already had a period of time in a different kind of environment where different kinds of relationships were being constructed in a post-independence moment. And initially, they really despised almost the younger, primarily economists who moved into development, who had no experience in other countries. They felt that they had a language of other places. They all spoke Kiswahili, for example, if they were to East Africa. They had a language, they knew those places very well. And here they thought these young upstarts who were doing fleeting consultancies, running around from one place to another, staying in, fancy hotels or enclaves, whereas they felt that they had much more immediacy with the people with who they ruled in their administration. So at the beginning there was a great deal of tension, and they felt that that this wasn't what development should be about. And over time, I think they lost out on that. So people would just feel, well, they were colonial administrators and people didn't really have a place in these newly formulated relations that were being constructed in the development industry. So I think it was very fraught, but it certainly got played out not only in the development work overseas from Britain, but within my institution and other agencies. And very interestingly is that many of the people who work in the British Council, which is the cultural side of Britain abroad, the English language classes and Shakespeare and music, and is that they very often they are the children of people who are colonial administrators, and that kind of sort of development picks up where colonialism left off, and the British Council picking up. There's a longer history. So the next book is the children of the colonial. I'm just going to track them down. They're going to see me coming. It's the children of the administrators, because so many of them are in Christian Aid, Save the Children, British Council. There's a whole reworking going on there about this legacy, whether it's the guilt of colonialism or whether it's a philanthropic gene. Your question on that's a really interesting question, because of course, there are all kinds of relationships that are taking place, all kinds of encounters that are taking place in very mundane spaces. And I think that those are not well understood as yet. I think we have some kind of understanding of institutional relations. So there's a lot of work that's done about, for example, ITDG, the Intermediate Technology Development Group, now not having expats in local offices. And they have local people as directors in local offices. There's all kinds of shifts going on there that try and mediate the very evident power relation, because the funds are still coming from the UK, for example, in that situation. But there are lots of encounters that take place, and I think that the work that I've done with research for colonial administrators were about those mundane encounters. They were about, what happens when an individual meets another individual. How do those encounters get played out? How do those kinds of friendships and partnerships get created, and on what kind of basis? So when you're talking about the valorization, I look at that primarily in terms of participatory discourse, which I feel very, very critical of, because I think what it does is reproduce those unequal power relations within a frame that makes us think that there are partnerships going on, makes us think that there is a greater inequality going on, but clearly there is all kinds of power relations being played out there, and I don't think that they're really understood that well. So partnerships, I'm very cynical, but I'm not saying there aren't partnerships. I'm just saying we have to think very clearly about what a partnership means and what kinds of relationships are embedded within them.
I think we will stop there for the moment. But before I thank Dr. Kothari and Kothari for our talk, I wanted to say to the students in the room that tomorrow from 11 to 11:30 to 1, there is a students-only session with Dr. Kothari in this room. Pizza and pop provided compliments of the Department of Science. It is run by the Graduate and Undergraduate Student Association department, so you're welcome to come to whatever department or community from wherever. Come on. Okay. But please join me in thanking Dr. Kothari.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your attention and this opportunity and your questions as well.
She'll also be writing on West End to do all at some point.
Yeah, that's